Hey everyone, this is Eric Sloof at the VMware TV booth, and I'm joined by Cormac Hogan and Duncan Epping. Hi guys, how are you doing?
Hi Eric, how are you?
I'm fine, thanks. So, you just finished the Power of Storage Policy-Based Management, the session you presented. Did it went okay?
I think it went well. We had a pretty packed room and a lot of interest from customers, a lot of good questions afterwards as well. That's why we were a bit late for this interview, but you know, that's life.
No problem. Are you hungry?
Actually, I can eat something, yeah?
I can offer you a real Dutch stroopwafel.
Nice.
Here you go.
Waiting for that. I've been waiting for that all week, some Dutch food. Cool, thanks.
Okay, so about your session, it's about vSAN, vFols, storage for cloud applications, but what I want to tune into is those special filters. Cormac, how can third-party vendors use those filters and what can they do with it?
Sure. So I guess I/O filters, a lot of people don't realize that it's not just for third parties. So VMware is also using I/O filters. We're using them for the latest version of Storage I/O Control. We're also using them for the VM Crypt feature as well. But what we mostly see the third-party vendors getting involved in I/O filters with is when it comes to replication, per VM replication, and also cache acceleration. So those are the two that we see the third parties getting involved in mostly.
Okay, and if we look at the kernel of an ESXi host, once the traffic leaves the virtual SCSI adapter, then it goes through these filters?
That's right. So yeah, and the thing is you can overlay these filters, so you could have multiple filters providing different data services. I kind of describe it as data services that are available on the ESXi host rather than relying on something that's array-based or HCI-based, for want of a better description.
And because of that, it's also per VM-based?
Exactly.
Or even per VMDK.
And this is where the policy comes in, because we can associate these policies with the different I/O filters on a per VM basis, or even a per VMDK basis. So you could have one VMDK that might require encryption, so you could associate the policy with that. Maybe another one to do cache acceleration, associate a policy with that. So very granular.
Okay, so you were mentioning the storage-based policy. What can you define in this policy? You define capabilities, or how does it work?
Well, it'll depend on the implementation that has been made by the third party, obviously. But what you'll be able to do is, in the building of the policies, you'll be able to select the capabilities that you require. So that'll be it. A lot of them is just enable it or disable it, but others have some more advanced features as well.
Talking about those capabilities can also be learned from VASA. So when you have a VASA provider, the third-party storage solution can make those capabilities known to vCenter?
Yeah, so they're all VASA based, so I/O filters as well has its own VASA provider. So it doesn't matter if it's VVols that is consuming SPBM policies, whether it's vSAN, or in this case I/O filters, has its own VASA provider, and that surfaces up the capabilities then as well. So architecturally they're all very similar.
Okay. So Duncan, a completely different subject. vRealize Automation version 8 is on the horizon. And I noticed a slide where you were talking about storage-based policies on demand. Can you explain a little bit about that?
Yeah, I guess the first thing we should have done before we started the interview is tell you that Cormac was actually presenting those slides, and he's the expert on those slides. So the question probably has to go to Cormac, because he ran through it in his lab.
Yeah.
Okay, so
I think the difference. So what we presented in the presentation, Eric, was we started with vRealize Automation 7.4, and with that there's a vRealize orchestration plugin. Still getting used to the vRealize thing.
To retrieve the policies from vCenter.
Yeah, and so what you're able to do then is through your blueprint, you can consume these policies and you can set these policies in place so that when you roll out a virtual machine automatically from your blueprint, you can inherit these policies as well. Now what Cloud Assembly is doing is it's removing this need for the orchestration plugin and having everything built into the Cloud Assembly itself. So from there, not only will you be able to consume pre-built policies, but you can also start building policies on the fly as well, using the different capabilities that VASA has surfaced up.
Okay, cool. So continuing with automation, I know you are great in scripting, Duncan. I've heard that there was a new release of Power CLI commandlets targeted at storage-based policies.
Well, actually, we've been supporting SPBM for the longest time. I don't think a lot of people were aware of this, but as soon as we started introducing vSAN and SPBM in general, the first SPBM capable Power CLI commandlets were introduced as well. It's just what we've started doing over the past couple of years is expanding on that particular set, especially when more and more customers have different types of needs. So, different requirements from what they can specify within a policy and what they can attach to a particular policy. Those commandlets have to change as well. For instance, with cloud native workloads or things like VRA, we need to take those different things into consideration. So we expand the policy driven capabilities in Power CLI. But it has been there more or less from day one to a certain extent.
Right, right. So you were mentioning vSAN. When you look at vSAN, do you agree with me that this is the momentum for vSAN? So the software is already in place, but what we see happening now is that we have new types of storage, NVRAM on the server side, and every day new types of storage are released, and more or less vSAN is already ready to go and enhance those techniques. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think the big benefit as VMware that we have is that we own the hypervisor, so we have vSphere as a platform. That also means for us as a business unit that works primarily on vSAN, is that as soon as vSphere supports something, so something like persistent storage that you were just referring to, that vSAN could potentially also leverage those types of storage devices. Now, the thing is, and I was just talking to a customer about that, is that these newer storage devices, they work at an extremely low latency, so the overhead from a storage stack perspective compared to, for instance, traditional spindles is quite significant. So in 6.7 and 6.7 update 1, we actually introduced some new mechanisms in which we can leverage those newer storage devices. But of course for vSAN it means we will need to evolve as well over time. I think for now though, most customers probably will be moving towards NVMe. NVDIMM devices or persistent memory are very difficult to procure, but they're also relatively expensive. And in most cases they will actually deliver performance which not a lot of customers will require, so they're not willing to actually spend that kind of money for performance that they don't need. But solutions like NVMe, of course that is something that I expect the majority of data centers move towards.
Yeah, so is there a new bottleneck on the horizon? Because if data is written into the caching tier, it also has to be written at a remote host. Yes. So 10 gigabits, is that a limitation? Is the storage faster than the network?
We are reaching that point. I think that's a very valid point, and we've actually had multiple customer discussions about that topic this week. We have customers doing 10 gig, 25 gig, 40 gig. We have some people doing 50 and 100 gigs as well. But it's also the reason for vSphere, for instance, why we supported RDMA. So for vSphere, you can do vMotion using RDMA networks. Okay. That is something, of course, that from a vSAN perspective, we're also planning to support. It's not supported as it stands right now. I had some customers that actually wanted to test it, so I kindly requested them to wait for that until we have the release that actually supports that. But the plan going forward is, of course, to support things like RDMA, but also things like NVM fabrics, for instance. That is also something that we can expect pretty soon.
Right, right, okay. So that's pretty cool. If that's supported, then it's even faster. There's no limitation at all, I think.
Well, there's always going to be some form of limitation. The thing is here, right, we've seen it with your own desktop as well. You can buy the fastest desktop you have. Within 6 months there's going to be an application which is going to swamp the CPU or use an excessive amount of memory. Developers will find a way to consume all of the resources you provide them. So it's going to happen. Okay.
So Cormac, question for you again. When we look at cloud native applications, Kubernetes, Docker, I can put a virtual machine on a certain policy, but am I also able to put a certain application on an individual policy?
Absolutely, it's a good question, Eric. I suppose if we take a step back, up until very recently you had Docker themselves claiming that containers were for stateless applications. So you stand something up, do a unit of work, and then you throw it all away and start over again. Right. There was no thought given to persistence. So for that reason we started a project called Project Hatchway, because we had a lot of customers who were looking to run container-based applications, next-gen application on vSphere on premises, and they wanted a way to do persistent storage. In fact, I think it's 7 of the top 10 Dockerized or containerized applications are requiring persistent storage.
Okay.
So we can do absolutely persistent storage through Docker. We have a plugin for Docker. We also have what's called a vSphere Cloud Provider for Kubernetes, and that allows us to create persistent volumes on vSphere as well that can be consumed by these next-gen applications. But to answer your question, I know I went a little bit around the houses on that.
Yeah.
We can absolutely specify in the storage class YAML files, which is how we create these persistent storage volumes. We can also specify policies as well. So for instance, if we were running Kubernetes VMs on top of vSphere and vSAN, we could specify something like deploy this VMDK that I'm going to use as a container volume with RAID 5 or a stripe with or RAID 1 or any of those policies that we support on vSAN. Yeah.
That's great, that's great. One last question for you, Duncan. In the first keynote, Pat Gelsinger showed one of those very small computers running ESXi, and I went to that booth and I asked, what is the use case? Maybe you can explain better that the use case for now is vSAN. Do you know what it does?
That's a great question. You're talking about the Raspberry Pi.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah, so we have some customers with very unique stretched cluster configurations or 2-node configurations, and what they would like to do is to have a third node in that same location that provides witness functionality. And the witness is actually a quorum device. So this is one of the reasons we started looking at leveraging a Raspberry Pi to be able to store those witness components on top of a Raspberry Pi, so that you have a full stretched cluster environment, for instance, in a submarine or on a cruise ship, or whatever it may end up being. And also, on top of that, have that witness in the same location with very low power requirements, but also no cooling requirements, because that's the great thing about a Raspberry Pi. Of course, there are other cool use cases as well. You could also create your own arcade machine or whatever it is, right? The Raspberry Pi is pretty cool, so that's some fancy use cases.
So it's used as a tiebreaker. You can also use a VM, but then you have to spin up a complete host, or you can use an individual host, but then you have cooling or you need more hardware, and that's the use case for the Raspberry Pi. I know that you're using a Raspberry Pi for your own gaming thing. How is it going?
Well, actually, I've just beat my son's high score on Pac-Man, so it's going really, really well.
Okay, great to hear, guys. Well, many thanks for the interview, and good luck.